Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 4, in which Phileas Fogg surprises Passepartout, his servants, beyond measure. At 25 minutes after 7, Phileas Fogg, having gained 20 guineas at whist, took his leave at his honourable colleagues, and left the Reform Club. At 10 minutes of 8 he opened the door of his house and entered. Passepartout, who had constantly studied his programme, was quite surprised at seeing Miss Mr. Fogg guilty of inexactness of appearing at this unusual hour. According to the notice, the occupant of Savile Row ought not to return before midnight precisely. Phileas Fogg first went to his bedroom, and then he called, "Passepartout!" Passepartout could not reply, for this call could not be addressed to him, for it was not hour. "Passepartout!" Mr. Fogg called again without raising his voice much. Passepartout persisted. "It's the second time that I've presented myself, that I've called you," said Mr. Fogg. "It is not midnight," replied Passepartout with a sigh. "I know it," continued Phileas Fogg, "and I do not find fault with you. We leave in 10 minutes for Dover and Calais." From some sort of faint grimace appeared on his round face of a Frenchman. It was evident that he had not fully understood. "Monsieur is going to leave home?" "Yes," replied Phileas Fogg. "We are going to make a tour of the world." Passepartout, with his eyes wide open, his eyebrows raised, and his arm extended, his body collapsed, presented the symptoms of astonishment, astounding to stupor. "Tour of the world?" he replied. "In 80 days," replied Mr. Fogg, "so we have not a moment to lose." "But the trunks?" replied Passepartout, whose unconscious swinging his head left to right. "No trunks necessary. Only a carpet bag, and two woolen shirts, and 3 pairs of stockings. The same for you. We will purchase on the way. You may bring down my mackintosh and travelling cloak, my stout shoes, and also we shall walk but little or not at all. Go!" Passepartout would have liked to make a reply, but he could not. He left Mr. Fogg's room, went up to his own, fell back into a chair, making use of a common phrase of country. He said, "Well, well, that's pretty tough. I who wanted to remain quiet." And mechanically he made his preparations for departure. The world, the tour of the world in 80 days. Was he doing this for business with a madman? No, it was a joke, perhaps. They were going to Dover. Good. To Calais. Let it be so. After all, it could not be to cross the grain of a good fellow very much, who had not trod the soil of his native country for 5 years. Perhaps they would go as far as this Paris, and indeed it would give him pleasure to see the great capital again. But surely a gentleman so careful of his steps would stop right there. Yet doubtlessness was not so true as he started out, and he was leaving home with his gentleman who, until his time, had been such a homebody. By 8 o'clock Passepartout had pulled in order the modest bags which contained his wardrobe and that of a master, and then, mind still disturbed, left his room and door, which he closed carefully. Then he rejoined Mr. Fogg. Mr. Fogg was ready, carried under his arm Bradshaw Continental Railway Steam Transit and General Guide, which was to furnish him all the necessary directions of his journey. He took the bag from Passepartout's hands, and opened it, slipped it into a heavy package of those fine banknotes which are current in all countries. "You have forgotten nothing?" he asked. "Nothing, monsieur. My mackintosh and cloak? Here they are." "Good. And take this bag." Mr. Fogg handed it to Passepartout. "Take good care of it," he said. "There are 20,000 pounds in it." The bag nearly slipped out of Passepartout's hands, as if 20,000 pounds had been in gold, weighed very heavy. The master and servant then descended, and then street door was double locked, and at the end of Savile Row there was a carriage stand. Phileas Fogg and the servant got into the cab, which was rapidly driven towards Charing Cross Station, at which one of the branches of the South Eastern Railway touches. At 20 minutes after the cab stopped before the gate of the station. Passepartout jumped out. His master followed him and paid the driver. At this moment a poor beggar woman, holding his child in his arm, her bare feet all muddy, her head covered with a rent bonnet, from her hung tattered feather, and a ragged shawl over torn garments, approached Mr. Fogg and asked him for help. Mr. Fogg drew his pocket the 20 guineas which he had won at whist, and giving them to the woman, said, "Here you go, my good woman. I am glad to have met you." Then he passed on. Passepartout had something like a sensation of moisture around his eyes. His master made an impression upon his heart. Mr. Fogg went immediately into the large sitting room of the station, and then Phileas Fogg gave Passepartout the order to get into first-class tickets for Paris. Then, returning, he noticed his 5 colleagues of the Reform Club. "Gentlemen, I am going," he said. "In the various vises put on a passport, I take that for my purpose and will enable you on my return to verify my journey." "Oh, Mr. Fogg," replied Gauntlet Ralph, "that is useless. We will now depend on your honor as a gentleman." "It is better so," said Mr. Fogg. "Do not forget that you ought to be back," remarked Andrew Stuart. "In 80 days," replied Mr. Fogg. "Saturday, December 21st, 1872, at a quarter before 9. Au revoir, gentlemen." At 45 minutes, 40 minutes after 8, Phileas Fogg and his servant took their seats in the same compartment. At 8:45, and the whistle sounded, and the train started. The night was dark, and the fine rain was falling. Phileas Fogg, leaning into his corner, did not speak, while Passepartout, still stupefied, mechanically hung up the bag with his banknotes. The train had not passed in them when Passepartout uttered a real cry of despair. "What is the matter?" asked Mr. Fogg. "Why, in my haste, a disturbed state of mind, I forgot what? To turn off the gas in my room." "Very well, young man," replied Mr. Fogg coldly. "It will be burned at your expense."